Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Lovely as ever to have so many of you on board, particularly for such an interesting presentation about such an interesting place with such an interesting bloke as Nick. How you doing, Nick? You all right?
I'm okay, thank you, Chris. How are you?
I'm very well.
Good.
I'm sure many of you know Nick, and many of you will have travelled with Nick, perhaps to Namibia or perhaps to other places around the world. But one of the things that Nick said to me many years ago was that if you sliced him in half, it would say Namibia down the middle, a bit like a stick of Brighton rock. Not sure whether it's true, but anyway. Nick, for those of you that don't know Nick, Nick is one of the directors of a lovely company. We've known each other for many years, and Nick not only designs trips and leads trips to some lovely places around the world, but also, of course, is a fundamental part of making sure our company runs smoothly and that all the trips get away as they should. You probably don't really want to hear from me, so I think without further ado, I shall pass directly over to Nick, save for one thing, which is just to remind everybody that there will be an opportunity at the end of Nick's presentation to ask any questions about the trip or about Namibia generally of Nick. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end, and you can do that by making use of the Q&A facility and the chat facility, which you will find at the bottom of your screens. But I'll come back on later. I shall remind you again a little bit later. And Nick, in the meantime, I shall hand over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And welcome, everyone. Welcome to this evening's presentation. It's about a specific group tour that I've been running for the last 8 or so years to Namibia, which is a country I've been going to now for the last 23 years. And the trip is called A Living Desert, and it's a small group tour where we take just up to 10 people or so on this itinerary, which goes to what I feel are some of the most important areas, if not the most important areas of the country. But equally, they are areas that complement each other because they are all largely arid areas, but they're very different habitats that sustain very different wildlife that have had to make very different adaptations to live in those habitats. And so that's why I've called it A Living Desert. And looking at the participants who are with us this evening, the attendees, I've counted so far, almost 30 of you have travelled with me on this trip over the last 8 years or so. So it's great to see some familiar names here, and hopefully there'll be 1 or 2 of you, if not more, that like the look of this trip and wish to join me for it. It'll be taking place in the early part of October this year, as it does every year. It's a great time to travel to the country. It's right at the very end of the winter period, so it's very, very dry, and it's just at the point where the rains are getting ready to fall. So those things mean that it's very good for wildlife, A, because the water levels are so very, very low, and therefore the wildlife concentrations, especially in the north of the country, in Etosha, very, very high concentrations of wildlife and good variety and good movement of wildlife. But also it means, therefore, that the bush, the habitat around the entire country is parched and very, very dry. So it makes it much easier to see the wildlife as well. So there you go. That's what the trip is all about, and that's when we go, and that's why I do it at that particular time. So this is the route that we follow. Now, I don't know how many of you know Namibia. I'm sure that many of you have travelled to the country before. And all of those who haven't travelled to the country, I'm pretty damn certain that it's been on your bucket list for a very, very, very long time. So hopefully this will be the presentation that tips you over the edge and gets you going there. So we arrive into Windhoek, having flown in from the UK, typically by Johannesburg. It travels up to the north of the country, first of all, to the eastern side of Etosha. Then it travels to the central part of Etosha on the southern side, before then heading right the way through the western side of Etosha, or over the western side of Etosha, and into phase 2 of the itinerary, which concentrates on the desert adaptations in the Skeleton Coast. And we visit 2 very important dried river systems, ephemeral rivers there, before then going right way up to the northern part of the Skeleton Coast, and then flying down to Swakopmund, which is the adventure capital, if you like, of the country, and then going into the northern part of the Namib Desert. And the way that we get around the country on this itinerary, which is pretty much 2 weeks to the day, is using light aircraft. So we use the Grand Caravan, the Cessna 208, and this is a great way of getting around the country. And as I say, we all fit into that aircraft, all 10, 11 of us, and then we are taken up to each of the lodges and transferred from one lodge to another using the aircraft. And this is a fantastic way to move around the country on this particular itinerary. Not only does it give you a greater understanding of the landscape of the country and how vast and remote it is, which is a very important part of the itinerary to highlight, but it also ensures that we can comfortably, or relatively comfortably, get into the very remote areas of the country that we wish to access. And that's especially the case when we're getting up into the Skeleton Coast area, which would take some days to get to by land. It's just a relatively short light aircraft flight to drop ourselves into the correct location and then make the final journey by land. So it's a great way to travel, and as I say, it does give you a sense of just how vast the country is, and how remote it is as well. It's worth saying that there's only just over 2 million people that live in the country. That's about 9 times the size of the UK. And so wilderness experience, remote wildlife experience are absolutely quintessentially Namibian experiences, and certainly the case on this particular trip. So the first flight, having arrived in Windhoek and having had a night in Windhoek just to recover from the international flight, takes us from the city airport up to Etosha National Park. And the first thing to say about Etosha is that I think that the eastern side is very different to the western side, which is very different to the southern side. In my experience, when I've been traveling to Etosha, I've always had the greatest experiences and the greatest encounters with the predators, typically on the eastern side. The habitat there favors cheetah in particular, and also leopard and lion, whereas on the western side, it's quite hard to find the predators there, even though the animals that they are preying on are there. Typically, the habitat that they prefer is over on the eastern side. The southern side is really good for the mass congregations of wildlife that Etosha is so well known for, especially towards the end of its winter period. So for this itinerary, I focus on the eastern side first, and then the southern side second, and we do a couple of days in each location. Both times, we want to base ourselves in the private reserves, which are just outside the national park. The private reserves are very good because they were built in the buffer zones when Etosha was first designated as a national park back in the 60s, when it formed pretty much the shape and the area and the size that it is now. So therefore, there is really good wildlife to be seen in the private reserve, as well as in Etosha. And we make use of the very good guides that they have at the lodge, who then take us into Etosha. And what we can expect to see on the eastern side is great wilderness and large savanna areas. On the eastern side, you're right on the edge of the salt pan, which dominates about 1/3 of the entire size of Etosha National Park. And the salt pan is a majestic site in itself. Etosha means big white place, and therefore, its name comes from the salt pan. And around the edge of the salt pan, you have wonderful grasslands, which bring in really great typical African wildlife, such as wildebeest. They don't have a migration there. There's not so many, and it's not large enough for that. But they do have really good herds of wildebeest to be seen there. Birchill zebra as well. They have large herds of black-faced impala, springbok too. As well as that, they have a lot of giraffe as well, southern giraffe as well. And typically, as you go into the park, what we'll endeavour to do is spend a lot of our time observing the behaviour of wildlife, and that's something that at this time of year is usually very, very active. As I say, the water is pretty sparse at this time of year, and so therefore the animals themselves are in a fairly heightened state of agitation, if you like, and they're wanting to get to the water, they're wanting to stay at the water, but as well as that, they're wanting to ensure that their family and their herd are having water as well. But sometimes tempers boil over, and you see some great activity there. And these are wonderful black-faced impala endemic to Etosha National Park. And we'll find that, if we're not seeing the wildlife when we're out driving, there are so many good water holes to be seen, to spend your time at on the eastern side, that we'll just go to a water hole, we'll turn the engines off, we'll park and sit and wait and watch. And there's always something to see. There's always birds around that we'll have fun, trying to identify. And then eventually, larger animals will come in. And this is the kind of scene that we're really wanting to try and find. These great concentrations of wildlife where you have a number of species coming together, they're herding round a small amount of water. Big herds of zebra to be found at this time. Typically, you can find 500, 600, or even 700 at a time without any problem. You do get very large herds of elephant as well. The breeding herds tend to start, coming together at this time. In this particular picture, you've got the springbok and the impala in front. You've got Birchill zebra all around. You've got a blue wildebeest in there on the right-hand side. You've got ostrich on the left-hand side. At the back, you've got the oryx with those straight horns, or the hemsbok. Southern giraffe coming in there. There's an elephant in there as well. And then flying above is a beautiful namakwa dove. And there's so much to be seen and so much to witness when you get these large concentrations coming together. It really is just fantastic to watch the way that the different animals interact with one another. A particularly memorable moment at a waterhole was on one of the first trips that I led, where at one of the southern waterholes, in fact, there was a very good concentration of wildlife at the waterhole, and eventually the animals started to move away and almost created a corridor, and we couldn't see it at the time because it was way off in the distance and behind some trees, but a herd of elephant came in, and the animals at the waterhole were absolutely understanding their place, making way for the herd of elephant to come in, and that was probably even more so the case because the herd had with them a very, very, very young elephant with them that could only have been about 2 or 3 weeks old. So you see wonderful behaviour in Etosha, and the water holes, as I say, they're typically very active at this time of year. And if you find good water holes, it's a really great opportunity for great photography, of course. But even if you're not into photography, it's a great place just to sit and watch and just take it all in and watch the way that animals interact with one another, and the way that they behave. And as I said, the breeding herds of elephant, at this time, they are typically very active as well. A single herd typically is about 20 or 30 elephants or so, something like that, of course dominated by the matriarch. Typically what happens at this time of year, you get 2, sometimes even 3 herds coming together and forming a very, very large herd of breeding elephant. And it's quite something to behold, to see 60 or more elephant all in one movement, making their way through the bush, making their way to the water. It's incredible when you see at a waterhole, you know, just surrounded by elephants as well. It's a great thing to witness. And you know, you can be in Etosha from sunrise until sunset, and typically that usually happens towards the end of the day, you know, after it's been very, very hot. They want to just cool off in the water, and when they smell the water and they're on a mission, and they really do move incredibly quickly as well. And that's something that you know, adds to the excitement of being in Etosha and moving with the wildlife and finding out where they're going and finding out where they've been, and you know, on the move all the time. There's also plenty of other wildlife to be seen apart from your typical plains game as well. There's hyena here. This spotted hyena, beautiful. They're usually found underneath some of the bridges or underneath some of the water channels that are there beneath the roads, and they're hunting in packs as well, often too. There are, so I'm told, brown hyena in Etosha. Now, I've never seen brown hyena in Etosha, and I wouldn't have typically thought that the habitat was especially good for them. You know, it's not particularly mountainous. There aren't those nooks and crannies high up where they can get away from everything. But there's 1 or 2 areas where I'm told brown hyena have been seen before, but typically they'll be seen, I think, elsewhere in the country on this itinerary. But there are lion everywhere in Etosha, and this particular image was of one of about 6 female lion that were just dozing by the side of the road. You know, you could have driven past them and barely noticed them. You know, such was their camouflage. It was absolutely wonderful. But you do see lion all around Etosha National Park, and really, for the time that we're spending there, famous last words, it should be a given that we will see lion. As for cheetah, at the Onguma Reserve, where we'll be spending our time, I've been very lucky to see cheetah inside the private reserve, which is perfectly located right beside the gate into Etosha National Park. It has its own reserve, which is bordering Etosha. It was part of the buffer zone. And we've had some wonderful encounters with cheetah here over the years. And this was a particularly wonderful encounter. I have to warn you to look away on the next slide if you're squeamish. A kill had been made, and this wonderful female was coming back just to attend to the kill that she had made. And we spent about 45 minutes or so just sat here and watching her behavior and watching the way that she actually, I have to say, quite respectfully dispatched with the kill. That was quite something. So the eastern side, as I say, is really good for those predators. Honey badger, I've seen honey badger there as well. So, you know, we should be lucky enough to see those. There's also leopard there. I haven't seen leopard that often on the eastern side, in fairness, you know, but that's the nature of leopard, particularly in Namibia. But the cheetah, you know, not only in the Onguma Reserve, but also on the plains on the eastern side of Etosha. I wouldn't say that they're commonly seen, but it's not that unusual to see them there, and it's a great thing to witness as well. Then as we come to the southern side, and what we'll do, we'll fly from the eastern side to the southern side as well, and that's just a really nice short flight of about 40 minutes or so. Saves what would otherwise be a pretty you know, fascinating but long, nevertheless, day-long safari to get from the eastern side to the southern side. And we'll fly right over the Etosha Pan. It will give you a real sense of scale and your sense of, you know, just how enormous Etosha is, about the size of Wales. Typically everything in the world seems to be about the size of Wales. But on the southern side, we have another private reserve, the Ongava Reserve, which, rather like Onguma, it's positioned right beside the gate into Etosha. And on the southern side, the elephant on the southern side are typically very, very good. And the southern side, its landscape is not quite as savanna-like as it is on the eastern side. As I say, the eastern side is dominated by, its eastern edge of the southern, the eastern edge of the salt pan, whereas the southern end, the salt pan doesn't stretch down to the southern side quite as much. So you have a lot more forest here, you have a lot more woodland. And so that brings, typically, a slightly different kind of feel to Etosha, where elephant are very, very prevalent, but, great antelope species as well. I love greater kudu, wonderful, wonderful antelope species. And then in Ongava, we have great opportunities to see not only white rhino, but also black rhino too. Now, they don't have that many black rhino here, and they're not free roaming black rhino as you have in other parts of Namibia, but nevertheless, they do have rhino. And Ongava typically translates as place of rhino as well. And here, if we're very fortunate, if we encounter one of the more welcoming, if you like, rhinos, then we will be allowed with the right guide to step out of the vehicle, and we may be able to walk within a respectful distance of the animal as well if they're relaxed and in the right kind of mood too. But Ongava is a really wonderful place. I travelled with a very, very nice gentleman from America 5 or 6 years ago, and he described it as absolute paradise. It is a really, truly very, very beautiful place, surrounded by wonderful kopje small mountains, terrific bird life, wonderful, wonderful bird life to be seen here, but also, great wildlife to be seen out in the reserve as well, very relaxed too. One of the other great things about rhino is that, about Ongava, is that they have other animals as well that you're likely to encounter. They've got a very good population of lion. They've actually got 2 prides of lion in the reserve, and you often see very good behavior between the males, but also sometimes with the prides who have their young cubs coming through as well. And this was quite something that we saw again as one of the early trips, where a very old giraffe was taken down overnight by one of the prides of lion, and in actual fact the second pride came along and gave assistance to that first pride, and then you had about 17 lions all together, all around the carcass of the giraffe through the night and well into the morning the following day as well. So you do see great wildlife encounters out in the reserve. You don't just have to be in the national park. It's great to be out in the national park, but it's also nice to come back to the reserve as well. And I always favour Ongava purely because it is a wonderful lodge with great setting and a very well established private reserve that's on the southern border of Etosha within the old buffer zone. But it has a wonderful hide overlooking its waterhole just at the foot of the lodge. And this hide is almost at water level. It's very well built, and the waterhole is a very active waterhole by day and also by night. So you are able to get some really terrific shots of wonderful animals coming to the water's edge. Black-faced impala. Through the day, you will get giraffe coming, and when you're just 20 feet away from a giraffe, as they do that wonderful A-frame stance and their neck goes down to the water. It's great to watch it. Of course, it's lovely to photograph it, but it is just great to actually put the camera down and just watch and take it all in. And through the day, if elephant will come, it does get extremely hot in Ongava during the middle part of the afternoon. At this time of year, right the way up into the late 30s, early 40s without any problem, and that heat is being magnified into the park itself by the mountains that are around, and so the elephant they will typically come to the water at the water hole in the early part of the afternoon. It's a great time to be down there, and again, just to sit and watch. If you want to photograph, that's fine, but to sit and watch and listen, that's the thing that sometimes we always forget to do. And it always strikes me when I see wildlife in close proximity like this, to actually almost watch with your ears and listen to the water being drunk, listen to it going down the gullet, listen to it coming up through the trunk. It's just great. Listen to the sound of the feet on the ground and knocking the rocks. This is the kind of experience that I want to give the group who comes with me, so that we have that holistic wildlife experience where all senses are part of the experience. And on occasion, during the daytime, if it gets extremely hot, then you do get some of the predators of the reserve coming to the water's edge as well. And as with all wildlife, you've got to be in the right place at the right time. And this was a particularly special moment. I often tell the story, so forgive me for those of you who've heard it before, but this was with a group, and this was our final morning at Ongava. And all the bags were packed. We were having our breakfast. I had my back to the water hole, and one of the guests leapt up in her chair and with some great excitement said, to words effect, "Oh my God, there's a leopard." Everybody was up and around, and we saw this leopard skulking in through the trees and came to the water's edge. And everybody rushed to grab their camera. I had to go and run to a room to get some clients who had gone to just get themselves ready for the journey and drag them out. And we had about 2 minutes before the leopard skulked off again. But that really was quite remarkable. And I haven't seen a leopard on Ongava before, nor since. So it was a particularly memorable encounter. But it just goes to show, as I say, being there at the right place at the right time. The wildlife is there. You just got to be really lucky with it. And we certainly were that particular morning. So Etosha is wonderful. And that, as I say, is phase one of the living desert, and a vast arid area that sustains a prolific amount of wildlife through its pumped water holes, through its natural spring water holes, and through the vegetation that is there as well. So then we fly out of Etosha and we head due west pretty much, and we go into phase two, which is a particularly exciting part of the itinerary, because we're going into the very remote areas of Namibia. And there's always great excitement when you've been flying for about an hour, and you can look out your window and you can see the western perimeter of Etosha, and you can say, right, we're now leaving Etosha National Park, and having flown over it for an hour. Well, that's only half of it. Again, as I say, you get to realize just how big it is. And then the landscape, subtly from that moment on, it changes in 3 or 4 different phases relatively quickly, because we're flying over the western concessions that border Etosha National Park and the Skeleton Coast National Park. And these community concessions are really important because they themselves harbour a terrific amount of very specialist wildlife. And first of all, we fly over the Hobbitary concession, and then it's over the Palmvach concession, and it's the Palmvach concession which is the home for the free roaming black rhino. So an completely unfenced area, naturally occurring free roaming black rhino can be found in that area. So we'll fly over there. We'll fly over the Etendeka Mountains, and then once we get over the Etendeka Mountains, and then we will start to go into the Skeleton Coast National Park itself. And this is where the landscape turns from a greeny, browny mountain texture, then into a more ochre, pinky, orange, desert-like mountain texture. And we start to see the ephemeral rivers emerging. And these are formed from the feet of all of those mountains that we'll have flown over. And they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's a really exciting journey to make. I personally think it's one of the best flights you can do in Africa. I haven't done them all, of course I haven't, but I'm going to put my flag in the sand and say it's one of the best flights you can do in Africa, perhaps even the world. How about that? But these are the flat top Etendeka mountains. For those of you who may have been to a completely different part of the world, Venezuela, you may think that these look rather like the Tepui, the flat top mountains down in Roraima, at the triple point where Guyana, Brazil and Venezuela form together. And they are very similar to that, much smaller, of course. But these are beautiful mountain areas to fly over. And you can see at the bottom of that image the beginnings of these ephemeral rivers, and you can see that there's a great deal of water underneath the surface of the ground by the amount of vegetation that is there. And then these are the Etendeka. This is the Etendeka range as it starts to get towards the Skeleton Coast National Park. So you can see that transition, and that happens in a relatively short amount of time as well. Incredibly beautiful, and quite like no other landscape that I've flown over before. And then once you get over that range, then you're into Skeleton Coast National Park area, and these are the winding ephemeral rivers. Now, if you haven't heard the phrase or term ephemeral before, well, for an ephemeral river, it is basically a river that doesn't flow all the time. It's a dried river. It is fed by rainwater. They have vast catchment areas, and we're going to be making our way to the Joynes River. There are many river systems in Namibia along the Skeleton Coast. There's 13 in fact, and on this particular trip we'll be encountering about 7 of them, a few of them by air, and then 3 or 4 of them by land. And the Joynes is going to be the first one that we spend our time exploring. The Joynes has a gigantic catchment area, 28,000 square kilometers. So all of the rain that lands in its catchment area is funneled down into this particular river channel. So vast amounts of water, colossal amounts of water come through here. It's a particularly exciting thing to see the Joynes actually flowing. I've only seen it flowing twice, and that was a very shallow flow at that. But it quickly dries out as well. And we'll be flying into a beautiful camp not far from the banks of the Joynes itself, and set in some of the most remarkable scenery that I feel you can see in the country. This area is just beautiful. It's like a lunar landscape, spectacular, and I find it a very spiritual place as well. Wonderfully wild, wonderfully isolated. Apart from the lodge and the camp that we're in, devoid of human intervention. Nomadic Himba pass through the area, but that's pretty much it. There are some very remote farming settlements here, but it's a wonderfully wild area in all senses of the description of the word wild as well. And the Joynes itself, it receives a colossal amount of water when the rains flow and is funneled down this very important channel. It dries very quickly, despite the amount of water that comes in. It does dry up really quickly, not only due to the heat and the sun and evaporation, but also due to the soft sand. It just being very porous, it just falls down through the bed of the river and into the aquifer beneath, and then the sun effectively bakes a hard shell, rather like an eggshell, over the surface of that, and that then seals the water in. And that hard shell-like surface then forms a very smooth platform for when the rains come again. The rains and the water, they just come skidding down the dried river with ease and with colossal force as well. the amount of vegetation that is here due to the water underground brings in actually a great deal of wildlife, nothing like on the scale in Etosha, of course, but there are very good typical plains game to be seen here. All have adapted to live in a much drier environment. You know, one of the kings and queens of adaptation are the gemsbok and the oryx. The national animal of Namibia, worth noting as well. As well as that, you have Angolan giraffe coming in, as well as southern giraffe as well. And when you've got those kinds of animals in an area, you're bound to have predators. The lion in the area are critically endangered, I have been lucky enough to see them with guests. Most of them are collared because they're critically endangered. Some of them are not. I'm not actually sure how many there are in the area at the moment. On the last trip in October, we didn't see any. But on previous trips, the number has been anything from 5 to 12. And this is in the whole of the Skeleton Coast National Park area that runs from the Huanib River all the way up to the Huarusib, which is an enormous distance. I'll show you that on the map. They are wonderful. To imagine that these animals are able to survive out here is quite something. It's a very humbling experience. I know those of you on the presentation who have been with me and we've encountered them have found it a very, very moving experience to spend time with them, and it really, really is. It's a phenomenally challenging environment for us to drive around in and for us to spend a few nights in. And the thought that, you know, the animals are living here, you know, pretty much 365 days a year, it really gives you great respect for the animals that are here. There's a very difficult human-wildlife conflict in the area, which, you know, you cannot escape from. You know, there are settlements, as I said, remote farming settlements in the area. And you know, when you've got remote farming settlements that have cattle, then you're bound to attract, you know, predators like this as well. And unfortunately, there is a conflict there, and that's why, you know, a number of the lion are collared, so that their movements can be tracked. Not only in an effort to protect them, so that we know where they are and that they can be driven away from certain areas. But also to educate farmers to let them know that lion are roaming around in the area, you know, and educate them on other measures that they can take to protect their animals, other than, you know, what we don't want to see happening. But it is a very, very important part of the journey to elaborate on, and it certainly forms part of the conversation throughout the trip as well. So fingers crossed, you know, but that really is a genuine fingers crossed moment there. But elephant, on the other hand, we're highly likely to see the desert adapted elephant, and I love seeing the desert adapted elephant. I always remember the first time I came to the Huanib about 15 or more years ago, and you know, drove into the area from Windhoek, which took about 4 days or so, and got to a very remote part of the national park, and in this river system we rounded a bend, and there was my first desert adapted elephant, and I have to say I got quite emotional about it, but it really is just a wonderful thing, and you've got all the time in the world with them to watch their behavior. There is a family who reside in the Huanib, who are about 9, and there's another family of about 6, and then there's a couple of bulls that you know, live in the area as well. And typically they spend most of their time moving up and down the Huanib River system, and they will then, when the rains come, move out of the Huanib, and they'll go perhaps further north to the Huarusib, or they'll go further south to one of the other rivers, such as the Uchab. But they're wonderful animals, and they have a very different approach to life than the elephant that you may have seen in Etosha National Park, and for that matter, the elephant certainly that you'd see, you know, in other parts of Southern Africa, like Botswana or somewhere like that. These animals have learned their behaviour from their matriarchs, in the same way that other elephant have, of course, but they've been taught very, very different techniques of survival. They've been taught to browse and move and browse and move so that the vegetation that they're eating has a chance to regenerate, in order that when they come back and to that same bush, there's new fresh vegetation there, unlike other elephant, which will just, you know, plow in and quite happily destroy an entire tree and destroy an entire bush and let it die, because they know there's much more of that where that came from, just around the corner. So they have a very different technique to survival. And of course, one of the other techniques they have most famously is that they're taught where the underground water sources are. They can smell it as well, but they're taught where it is at its shallowest, so closest to the surface. And there they're taught how to dig for it with their front foot and also with their trunk as well. And sometimes you see that behavior as well. And you see other impressive behavior as well, such as reaching and stretching for the very best parts of the tree. And they will often go up on their hind legs, which is something you don't often see, or don't really see, certainly in other Southern African countries, so much with the elephant that have so much vegetation all around them. And there's often newborn to be seen as well. Typically, they are very relaxed. I've had one, close encounter with one of the bulls who was not really in the mood for having his photo taken, which is a different story. But typically, they're very, very relaxed and they're very understanding. And they're keen to just concentrate on eating and drinking. That's really what they're doing. And as I say, you do see some wonderful behavior as well with the way that they interact with their habitat. And you see some wonderful sights as well. And one of the things I especially love about this part of Namibia, the landscape, the volume is turned right way up to 11 on a maximum of 10, and that in itself is impressive enough. But when you see the wildlife in that habitat as well, to me that really sets things off. And can't wait to go back, and I always hate leaving. It really is just a really truly magical place, and there's some really wonderful encounters you can have sometimes where you feel a sense of isolation, or you feel a sense of solitude, or perhaps even a sense of loneliness. But the wildlife that is here is anything but, and it knows its habitat so well. And it's perfectly adapted to survive in it too. If you were to take a desert elephant and plonk it in, I don't know, the Okavango Delta, no problem at all. It'd be absolutely delighted to have so much water and so much vegetation there. It wouldn't have to work so hard. You take an elephant that's grown up in the Okavango Delta and put it into the Namib Desert, or put it into the Skeleton Coast, it just simply won't survive. It won't understand. It won't have learnt the techniques. And that's really what I love about seeing the wildlife in the Skeleton Coast. Food, close to my heart as well. And don't worry, I make sure that we're all very well catered for wherever we are, even in the most remote parts of the country. There's plenty of food for us as well, and plenty to drink too. So have no fear on that, on that particular question. So then from the Juanib, what we're going to do, we're going to then drive rather than fly. We're going to drive further north, and this is one of the most fantastic one of the most fantastic land journeys you can do in Namibia. So having done certainly what I think is one of the best flights you can do in the country, we're then going to do what I think is one of the best road journeys you can do in the country. And this is going to take us from the Juanib River up to the second most northern river of the country, which is called the Huarusib. And this is going to take us high over the Skeleton Coast National Park on a desert plain that takes us right the way over this wonderful arcing landscape, sea level from the Huarnib up high into the mountains over this high desert plain, and then descending down back again to sea level to descend into the Huarusib. And I think it's really important to come to the Huarusib because it's a very different ephemeral river to that of the Huarnib. The Huarnib River cuts through desert, dunes, simple as that. Whereas the Huarusib is canyon-like, it's gorge-like, it's dominated by these very, very deep rock channels. And we'll drive into this river system and then make our way due west. This is a really, really exciting journey. And I know that, for those of you on the presentation who've done this with me, were thrilled and blown away by its, majesty as well. And in the Huarusib, there are elephant here too. There's a couple of bull. There's not as many as in the Huarnib, but there's 3 or 4 up here that we may encounter. Bird life, however, is absolutely on fire here. Terrific numbers of beautiful birds to be seen throughout the whole of the Huarusib. And the Huarusib has some terrific geological formations as well. These are the ancient rock castles, or the sand castles, that are actually deposits from ancient lake that used to fill this entire area. So if you imagine this, this river flows when it's flowing from east to west, like the Huarnib, and it flows out into the Atlantic Ocean, which is eventually where we will end up on this particular journey. But thousands of years ago, this river system was blocked off by an enormous sand dune, which blocked the Huarusib River. And so, as the rains were falling in its catchment area, the water would come down and it basically fill because it couldn't push through that enormous dune that was blocking it off. And so this enormous lake formed. Then an enormous rain happened, and eventually there comes a tipping point with a flood where the weight of the water gets so great that it has to push through, and it did push through that sand dune, and it washed that sand dune away, and with great force, that water pushed through, and the lake fell down basically and went out into the Atlantic Ocean. And because that lake was from rainwater catchment, it had brought down an enormous amount of sediments that had built up as well. And because the lake fell so quickly, it left this sediment here. And these wonderful towers now are left standing, which were once enormous walls of sediment, and the wind has now eroded them into these wonderful formations. So it's an amazing place to go and see the Huarusib River, and a really, really challenging place. And as we get further out towards the Atlantic Ocean onto the beaches of the Skeleton Coast National Park, we'll see ever increasing lonely wildlife, solitary henspot, may see the solitary elephant, and then we get out to the mouth of the Huarusib. And I've been here before, and this is a Himba settlement that had established themselves just in the ankle, in the shoulder of these mountains. They knew that they wouldn't be able to be there all year, but for whatever period of time that they were there for, they felt that that was a good place to be, and they were able to live there for a number of months in their kraal, in their settlement there, in their boma, and then then they moved on. Being nomadic people, they don't hang around for too much time in one place. And then wonderfully, we get to the very end of that wonderful journey out of the Huarnib into the Huarusib, and we come to this incredible accommodation. You'll note that I haven't shown you pictures of the accommodation so far, but they're all wonderful. But this is a particularly impressive lodge. It's right on the Skeleton Coast beach. It's about 1.5 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean, and it's called Shipwreck Lodge. Fantastic place. It's been here for now, I guess it must be 4 years or so, something like that. I think that's probably where we're at with it. And very exclusive, and very, very beautiful. Not only because each of the accommodations are these individually designed ship huts, which have wonderful views over the tundra beach down to the Atlantic Ocean, but have a backdrop of the northern reaches of the Namib Desert, believe it or not, which has been blown all the way up here as well. But there's also a terrific lodge area which is used for serving our meals. It's got a great sitting room which has got wonderful books to read, all of the incredible stories of the area, and there are amazing stories of this area, of great epic journeys of survival, of journeys of rescue and recovery of shipwrecks that have been stranded up here. It's just an amazing place to come to, and we'll have a couple of nights here to really explore the coastline. Hopefully we'll see some brown hyena that I've seen here before, but again, wonderful bird life. You see great activity here, Cape Fur seal colonies, but I think it's fair to say that by the time we're coming out here, this trip is certainly in phase 2 of the living desert theme, but this is where the journey is as much of a safari of landscape as it is of wildlife, and this is one of the things that I'm always very keen to share with clients who travel with me, to give them a sense of what the landscape is doing, how the landscape has come to be, how the environment has come to be, and as I say, the stories that go along with it as well, which are of human endeavour. Mines were put here to try and mine for dimes, and there are wrecks and remnants to illustrate that. There's wrecks of aircraft that crashed here. There are wrecks of ships that have been stranded here, and as I say, there's wrecks of remnants of diamond mines and old airstrips, and there's whale bones littering the whole place. It really is a very, very, again, wild place, and what these images don't really portray is just how harsh the landscape is as well. The currents of the Atlantic are extremely strong. The wind is relentless, but for me, it is all part of that experience, and it's all part of the journey. And then the journey will then continue as we fly from that northern part of the Skeleton Coast. We'll meet up with our aircraft again, and we're going to fly all the way down the edge of the Skeleton Coast and down to Swakopmund. And from Swakopmund, we'll then journey further down the coast after a restful night, where we hope to see some of the greater and lesser flamingos that will still hopefully be in the Walvis Bay Lagoon. They do migrate up on a one-night migration right up to Etosha National Park when the rains start falling in Etosha. And because we're here, at that cusp time, if the rains do start to arrive a little bit early, the flamingos will be gone. But the way that we've done it so far is that largely the flamingo are still hanging around in the lagoon, and there's a great number of them to be seen in the lagoon as well. It's a great photo opportunity for everyone. And there's also some wonderful desert ponds just behind the lagoon, which also add to a great backdrop of photographing flamingos and birds when you've got wonderful ponds that are surrounded by enormous dunes, and then to have flamingo flying around in large flocks as well. It's quite a thing to behold. And then our final phase of the itinerary is going to be in the northern part of the Namib Desert. And now this isn't a photograph I've taken, sadly, maybe one day. I'll be able to afford to take a flight into space and see the Namib Desert from space. And that is the Namib Desert on the bottom right-hand side of the image. And you can see that there's a very clear, distinct line that the Namib, where the Namib stops. And this is the third ephemeral river that we will encounter, which is called the Koisib. And the Koisib has a big catchment area in the Naukluft Mountains, which are off to the east. If you imagine the Namib Desert is effectively, in simple terms, being blown north all the time. And the Koisib River is an ephemeral river as well, so it's dry for most of the year. So that dune sand is being blown north, so into the river system throughout the year. The rains fall towards the end of October. They will gather in the Naukluft Mountains, and then they will flow through the Koisib Canyon and down the Koisib River, effectively washing all of that sand out of the riverbed and into the Atlantic Ocean. And so therefore, over the millions of years that process has been happening, the Namib Desert has barely moved north over the Koisib River. There is a much bigger story to that journey, which I will save for another time, but that's only the middle part of a colossal journey that the sand is making from South Africa up to Angola. As I say, I'll save that for another time, but this is where we're going to stay. It's a very simple, rustic accommodation, and I will not put any gloss on that at all whatsoever. We'll be staying in beautiful, high-end luxury, if you like, accommodation throughout the trip. I would actually put the very simple, basic accommodation in the same category on this particular instance, because the guiding that we will have and the location that we have is second to none. In my opinion, it is the best place to stay in the Namib Desert, full stop, even if it is the most basic and simple of accommodations. And it really is very, very basic. It's clean, it's comfortable, we have beds, but that's about it. It's in this incredible location, this Eden of the Namib Desert, where very few people come to visit this area, and even fewer people are allowed access to the area that we will be going into. And it's because of the very good contacts and the very fond relationships and friendships that I've been able to forge with some scientists and researchers who study the Namib Desert, that we're able to use their licenses to gain access to some very, very, very fragile and important areas of the Namib Desert. And it is so beautiful, the desert. It has to be the grand finale of this particular trip. And here we're not going to be concentrating on any of the big stuff. We will hopefully have done all of that. We're going to be concentrating on the small stuff, the weird stuff, and the kind of stuff that on many other safaris we would all, pass by, step over, drive across, whatever it is. And I'm just going to zoom in to this particular image, so I hope that this is going to work. So this image is, as you saw, it's the slip face of one of the dunes. And we're going to go out and for a couple of days and track the really small stuff, and we're going to learn the tracks of the really small stuff. So just to give you an idea of what's been happening here, these tracks, I hope you can see my cursor, but these tracks are of various different small geeky animals. We've got the hairy-footed gerbil here, which has made tracks here. We've also otherwise known as the Namib dune gerbil, but I'm sure you knew that anyway. We've got batted fox track here. We've got here another dune, Namib dune gerbil, making its way up the side of the slip face here. This here, you can see a very faint swim channel of a golden mole. And here, over here on the right-hand side, we've got a terrific track here of a legless skink, and there's another legless skink track there as well. So what we're going to be doing is spending time learning about, as you may have guessed, the small stuff. And we'll come out early in the morning with one of the scientists there, one of the heads of research here, and we're going to learn all about the behavior of the animals overnight, and we're going to be fascinated by it. And you know, I think it's fair to say that everybody who I've brought to this place, having done this journey, they all say this was one of the best experiences of the whole trip, because we're able to spend time with nobody else around us, with the dedicated life knowledge of people who have devoted their entire working career and many years before that being obsessed and fascinated with the Namib Desert. And we'll go out and do something that we call reading the morning news. So we'll go out early in the morning and we'll discover tracks like this, and we'll learn about what animals made these tracks and what they may have been doing. So I'm going to do a little mark your own quiz here. This is the track of an animal. What animal do you think this might be the track of? I'll give you a clue. It's a bird, okay? And it's a bird which is endemic to Namibia and the Namib Desert. Actually, I should say sub-Saharan Africa, but often found in Namibia. And this is actually of the dune lark. So the dune lark would have come hopping in here, and you can see two of its little prints here, and made its way to this area where clearly there was something there that it wanted to eat, and with great excitement destroyed that animal that was there, whatever it was, and then hopped off here into the distance. And if you don't know what a dune lark looks like, this is a dune lark, a very, very beautiful bird indeed. And there's an area that we'll go to where hopefully we will see them. They are not particularly common to be found along the skeleton coastline, but in the Namib we should be lucky enough to see them. Here's our next one. What animal do you think this was? Well, it's not quite as pretty as a bird, and it's not quite as hairy as a gerbil. This, believe it or not, is a spider. And the spider that made this is one of the best spiders, I think, ever. It's called the dancing white lady spider. And I should say that this is just the dancing white lady spider. There are two types. There's also the giant dancing white lady spider. And this is what the dancing white lady spider looks like. This is the giant one. So if you imagine its diameter is about that of a tennis ball. And then there's the regular one, which I'll show you here. This is a little bit smaller. Actually, this was taken on my iPhone. And what the dancing white lady spider does is literally that. It dances. When it gets very excited, it vibrates and it creates these imprints in the sand. And that circular imprint in the middle is its abdomen rubbing on the sand. And then those little marks on the outside are its feet, and it kind of dances, rotating around, creating these wonderful imprints there overnight. And sometimes quite a few of them come together and have a bit of a disco with themselves as well. So there you go, the dancing white lady spider. And this is a very cool animal indeed. I did mention it earlier. This is a swim channel of the golden mole, and this is what the golden mole looks like. So has a triangular head and has like a leathery patch at the end of its snout, really, and degenerated eyes with skin that's grown over them with fur on the skin. Doesn't have any ears, but it has an enlarged middle ear bone, so it's able to sense vibrations from great distances, and it swims through the very, very soft sand typically. It will scuttle across the top of the sand sometimes, but then dives into the sand to then sense vibration and heads towards the vibration, which is its prey. fast moving, certainly, and nocturnal as well. This wonderful gecko is a palmetto gecko, sometimes called the web-footed gecko, other times called the sand dune gecko. But the palmetto gecko, as I know it, is a very, very fast-moving gecko. It has feet like a web, not only so that it can burrow well into the sand, into the cooler sand, which is, you know, not that far from the surface of the Namib, but it wants to burrow into the cooler sand where it just hangs out during the day, and then comes out and then runs along the surface of the desert with its web feet. It's also got these tiny little hooks, hair-like hooks on the underside of its feet as well to help it grip. There's these terrific eyes, so it has a great sense of vision, of course. Doesn't have any eyelids. It has a translucent membrane over the eye that it licks clean, but not to be confused with the shovel-snouted gecko, or any of the other many other geckos that can be found in the Namib as well. There are many other insects that we're going to discover in the dunes as well, like the top-tocky beetle, like the cartwheeling spider, scorpions as well, tree bark scorpions, which we'll hopefully see at night. But brace yourselves, because you'll probably take more photographs in the desert than you will on any other part of the journey, and it's usually of, you know, wonderful landscapes and, you know, minuscule grains of sand as well. The sunsets are pretty cool in Namibia, of course, as well. The night skies are just remarkable too. It's a trip that I love leading. It's a trip that I'm sure, if you're interested in going to Namibia, will take you to some parts of the country that maybe other trips won't take you to. And I hope that it will also explain a story as we go along as well, which is something that I'm very keen to do with all of my trips. And that's what I wanted to present. So I'm terribly sorry, but I've been waffling on for over an hour. So Chris, I need to have a glass of water. I'll let you talk for a minute.
I was going to say, you started off enthusiastic, Nick, but I've got to tell you, you became even more enthusiastic as you progressed through the course of your presentation. Wow, that's amazing. Can I come with you?
No.
Thanks. I think I'm in Zambia in October anyway.
There we go.
What a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. We've had lots of people on our presentation, haven't we, during the course of this evening. So thank you very much, everybody, for being involved. We've got a bit of a question and answer session to have. But before we have our question and answer session, I am going to click on this, which is our poll, and ask you, Nick, now you've had a quick drink of water, if you wouldn't mind just giving a quick highlight of what the differences are between these different trips, during the course of which perhaps anybody who would like to ask any questions can share those questions with us on the Q&A.
Yep, sure thing. So I think I can't actually see the poll myself, Chris, so I'm going to go off from memory, but obviously the top trip, not the top trip in terms of best, but the top trip, top of the list, is the Living Desert Group Tour, which I've just explained to you. So I hope that that's pretty self-explanatory what that is. It's a small group tour, as I say, 10 or so people with me, flying to those 3 key areas in Namibia, departing in October this year. The next one is called Wildlife and Wilderness. That is also a group tour. That's land-based, and that travels from Windhoek to a very good reserve called the Okanjima Reserve, where an excellent wildlife conservation organisation called Africat based themselves. So there's a couple of days at Okanjima before then going to Etosha National Park, as we do, and then it drives down through Damaraland, which is the area kind of southwest of Etosha, and makes its way down to the coast. And then it goes into the Namib Desert, but a different area of the Namib Desert to that which I go into. I go into the northern part because of the Kuisib River system. This goes into the middle central area of the Namib Desert, Sesriem and Sossusvlei, which are the most visited parts of the desert, if not actually the whole country. And that's where the extremely large sand dunes are, and you get these very big dune corridors there as well. So that's a nice trip to do. If you're into photography, then of course Namibia is I think it's one of the most photogenic countries you could wish to travel to, and the wildlife there is certainly worthy of a dedicated photography trip. I have to say that a living desert is not a dedicated photography trip. I do like photography. I'm not very brilliant at it. I can help a little bit with it, but it's not a photography trip. If you want a photography trip, then the one to do is the Wonders of Namibia, and that is a trip that Emma Healy in our wildlife sales team, and many of you will have travelled with her to Brazil and a couple of other places. Brilliant photographer. She runs a dedicated photographic trip, and that goes to a lodge just outside Etosha National Park on the southern side. It goes into Etosha National Park, and it comes down to the desert as well. So if you're wanting to be in a photographic group with like-minded photographers, then that's a really good option for you. And then the last one, Namibia self-drive. You know what? Namibia is so good for self-drive. So if you don't want to do the flight, if you don't want to do the group tour, and you want to do it in a way that you've got a sense of independence, then Namibia is brilliant for self-drive. There's loads of different ways you can do it, to be honest with you. And our self-drive safari option is just one way. It's probably the most obvious way and one of the most common routes to do. It's an anti-clockwise. It's a clockwise route which drives down to the desert, then to the coast, then through Damaraland, then to Etosha, and then back to Windhoek. There are other, there's any number of self-drive routes that you can do in the country. I've done an awful lot of them there, but needless to say, Namibia is a brilliant option for self-drive in Africa. Not all African countries are, but Namibia is just made for it, and it's got a very good infrastructure to cater for the self-drive as well. So 4 really good trips there.
That's brilliant, Nick. Thank you very much. And just before we go into the throwing a couple of questions at you, I just want to read out a couple of things that people have said, which back up, I would suggest, some of your great enthusiasm for the country, which I also have, incidentally, but not in quite so much dynamism as you, because I don't know the place nearly so well. Paul says, wonderful, thank you, brings back some great memories. Peter says, it brought back some good reminders of my trip to Namibia last September. Alison says, wonderful memories of our trip all those years ago, particularly liked all the activities with those amazing guys at the Desert Research Centre. There you are. So you already said that. Hey, let's chuck a couple of questions around. Sure. Paul has asked how many guests there are in the safari vehicles, which is actually one of those kind of burning questions that lots of people like to know the answer to. And although it's not a dedicated photography trip, as you have clearly illustrated, there are some really wonderful photographic opportunities. So it's quite a good thing to know the answer to.
Yeah, so each accommodation we use 2 vehicles. That's a must. Because everybody has a camera, whether it's on an iPhone or any of the other mobile devices or a big lens camera. So yeah, we always use 2 vehicles, and those vehicles are open-sided vehicles, typically in Etosha, and on the eastern side, 2 open-sided vehicles on the southern side as well. And then when we get into Skeleton Coast, I prefer to use the closed vehicles because of the amount of sand, and it's a very soft, fine sand. But we've used 2 vehicles there as well, and they've got pop-up roofs. However, on my most recent trip, we actually used open-sided vehicles, and it wasn't too bad. And then down in the desert, all of the stuff that we do there again is in 2 vehicles there, and we use closed vehicles there definitely. But we're getting out so much. We're stopping every 5 meters almost. So we used closed vehicles there. But in short, 2 vehicles, and I split it so we've got 5 or 6 people in each vehicle, so everybody's on the side.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you for that. Jan has asked whether there is a fence between the national park and the private reserves, and whether the wildlife can move between the private reserves and the national park. And Marilyn has asked, because it's a related question.
Hear you.
Can you hear me, Nick?
Oh yeah, I can now. Yeah.
I didn't say anything. No, you're hearing things. No, I did say something. I was just joking. Can you hear me now?
Okay. I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. So Jan has asked whether there's a fence between the national park and the private reserves, and therefore whether the animals can move freely between them. And a related question from Marilyn has asked why you visit the private reserves and not Etosha National Park itself.
Okay, so there is a fence going all the way around Etosha National Park, yeah, that's it. And there's a fence that sits between the 2 private reserves that we go to. The reason that we stay in the private reserves that are just outside Etosha are that on the eastern side, the only other option is to stay at the government-run camp, which frankly is not worthy of any visit. And as I said in the presentation, what we do is stay in the private reserve outside of Etosha National Park, and the guides, we do our safaris inside Etosha National Park. So we're just using the private reserve as a base for accommodation to go into Etosha National Park. We do a morning drive on the private reserve because it's worthwhile. And that's exactly the same on the southern side as well, for exactly the same reasons. The southern camp, if you like, the southern lodge in Etosha National Park is also the headquarters of Etosha. And it's a very, very busy area. The accommodation's not especially brilliant. It's much better that we have a higher level of accommodation with much better wildlife opportunities on our doorstep, such as that wonderful hide with the waterhole, access to a brilliant private reserve, but also guided drives inside Etosha National Park. So we have the best of both worlds, to be honest with you, by staying just outside the national park itself.
Brilliant. And there's you were talking about being on and around the dunes and so on. Is there walking involved? I mean, and if so, how much on the trip?
Yeah, there is walking. I think that it's so in Etosha. No, we're in the vehicles.
Yeah.
Out in Juaneb, I would say that yes, we want to be getting out of the vehicles and wandering around as wherever we can, and usually along the coastline, but it's not too difficult there. In the desert, though, certainly it's very soft sand, and we're not going to be walking great distances, but it is a very, very soft sand. I would say, though, on my last trip, we did have 1 or 2 clients who weren't as confident with their balance and weren't as confident with walking, but they were able to do all of the trip. It's just that on 1 or 2 of the opportunities where we were able to get out of the vehicle and walk around in the desert, they chose not to. So, for example, that reading the morning news, as I put it, when we go out in the morning to identify some of the tracks, one of the clients said that they wouldn't want to do that. But that was fine, because what we did, we drove them up to the area that we were doing that. we got some chairs out, got some flasks of hot drinks out, and they watched the sunrise, from the comfort of a camping chair, in the area that was outstandingly beautiful, watching the sunrise over the Namib. So there are ways around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick, do you need to be particularly fit to join the trip then, or just average
No.
fitness? That what you would say?
No, you don't need to be fit to join the trip. No, we're not walking great distances. Not at all. Not at all. It's a very sedate trip.
Okay, brilliant. So for John, who has posed the question of or said he's 75 and wondering whether this would be out of his reach or not, I think your answer would be that it's not out of his reach.
I would agree. I would agree. And John, if you want to give me a call in the office to have a more specific conversation about your needs or your concerns, or want to know a little bit more detail about the itinerary, any nuances, then I'm really happy to talk you through anything else that you need to know, just to give you an informed decision.
That is brilliant. Thank you. And Nick, I think so two. I'm going to just pose, well, actually three other questions. In relation to this trip, Bjorn has asked whether there's any scope for night drives at any of the lodges.
I'm thinking, no, unfortunately not. No, they don't advertise as doing specific night drives. There will be, of course, times when we're driving back to the lodge in the dark, and certainly that will be the case when we're in the Skeleton Coast. But to be brutally honest, we're not really. It's not really night drive territory, and I know the kind of thing that you're wanting to see on night drives, and we're not really, it's not really that kind of territory. Of course, in Etosha National Park, you're not allowed to drive at night anyway. Right. Although there'll be, I'm sure, one or two drives that we're making out of the park, as the sun is setting, or just after it has set sometimes. But in the private reserve, yes, we'll be doing a night drive back to the lodge, but I wouldn't wish to sell this as being, a dedicated night drive as such.
So in other words, not night drives as one might do in the Luangwa Valley, for argument's sake, or one or two.
Absolutely right. Yeah, correct. Yeah. In the Luangwa, you go out specifically on a night drive to go and see leopard, etc. No, there is not a dedicated night drive activity. Correct.
Sure. Okay. So a couple more questions. One relates to temperature. What kind of temperatures would you be out and about in? And do the lodges have, or any of the lodges have, air conditioning? And a related question to that, you were referring to particularly basic accommodation in the final place, if I remember rightly. And by basic, do you mean that it doesn't have ensuite facilities?
No. So let me do the first one first of all. In terms of temperatures, we're going to experience a full range of temperatures by daytime, up to mid to late 30s, as I said, particularly on Gava, where it gets very, very hot. I would say, mid to late 30s, maybe a little bit more as well. But it kind of like tips up to that point, doesn't hang around at that point for too long, and then starts to dip down again. It gets up to that kind of heat, kind of 3:30 or so, something like that, and then starts to tail off soon after that. But when it does
dry
tail
heat,
off,
though, isn't it?
It is a dry heat. Yeah,
so it's not quite, it's
absolutely.
not oppressive. It's not like that.
No. It's the kind of heat where you just absolutely. You feel the sun on your face heat, as opposed to you feel yourself melting away heat. And then at night time, it does get pretty chilly, especially over in the Skeleton Coast. You'll be getting down to 5 or 6 degrees or so at night time with the wind. So it doesn't really get too much worse than that. In the desert, it'll be perhaps a little bit chillier than that, but certainly not down to 0 or anything like that. So a down jacket is really good. Fleeces, etc., that kind of stuff, really good. A woolly hat, I always take a woolly hat with me just in case it gets a little bit chilly. That's good. The vehicles for the early morning drive and you know, coming back, they always have ponchos and blankets and that kind of stuff. So, you know, we're not going to feel cold unless, you know, if we can possibly help it. In terms of the basic accommodation, no, it is all en suite, you know, and it's all private. You have an entire, if you like, you know, apartment chalet to yourself individually. It's just that, you know, it is not a designated private lodge kind of feel. That's all I want to say. It's a wonderful place to go to. The people are brilliant. They cater for us wonderfully. It's a centre of excellence, this place. But the accommodation, it's really clean. Everybody's got private rooms, as I say, private chalets. It's all en suite. It's just very simple and basic. It's not dirty. It's nothing like that. It's just, you know, a simple accommodation to stay at. It's wonderful.
It's the right lodge in the right place by the sounds of it.
And as you know, with accommodations, it's all about location. It's all about location, and you couldn't be in a better place. Okay,
that's brilliant. Couple of other final questions, along with all the other final questions I've asked you. So I do apologise, but it's interesting stuff. It's great. It's good. One relates to this particular trip that you've been describing, and whether we yet have dates for 2024. And I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. Do you?
No. Well, I do know the answer, and I'm afraid that no, we don't yet. Availability is the thing that we're kind of, well, I say we, I'm trying to establish with our suppliers. So it'll be coming, though. It will be coming.
Great. Okay. Baggage allowance, is that limited on the light aircraft? I imagine it is limited, but I imagine that you're getting washing done at almost everywhere.
Yeah, but to be honest with you, because we're in the caravan, the 208s, and because we have it privately, they're pretty forgiving actually. So if we were in the 210, which is the little Kalahari Ferrari, then it would be a problem. But because we're in the caravan, actually they're pretty chilled about it, pretty relaxed about it now. So I don't want to say here, you know, publicly, yeah, you can have 20 kilograms, no problem. But in all honesty, 15 kilograms, you'll be absolutely fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick, any Himba, any visits to any Himba settlements, or is that something that could be organised as an extension, perhaps, to the trip, or how is this a possibility?
No, and forgive my bluntness of the answer there. So we can't guarantee it because the way that I would like us to encounter Himba is in the natural way, whereby we just happen to be in the right place as they are coming through. They are nomadic after all. What I don't want to do is crowbar into the itinerary a visit to a rather contrived exhibition. You know, a traditional Himba village, in inverted commas, is not the kind of experience that, you know, I want to take people to, because it isn't traditional. You know, it doesn't give anything to the community. It doesn't really give an awful lot to us. So if we do have Himba encounter, I think it would only be in Skeleton Coast National Park, and only if we're lucky enough to actually be in the river system where, you know, the Himba have settled for you know, a period of time that we are passing through, which I have to say I think would be unlikely, given that the rains will be, you know, beginning to you know, get ready to fall, and the rivers will be in flood within, you know, 3 or 4 weeks of us being there.
Okay, cool. And then the final question I am going to pose to you relates actually to Emma's photographic trip. Pamela has asked how many there are on the photographic trip, which I can say to Pamela is a maximum group size of 6. But just like clarification on whether it's flying and driving, but I'm not sure about this one. I don't think there are any internal flights. I think it's driving only, but you might know the answer. And if not, between us, we will be able to come back to Pamela tomorrow and to clarify that.
So yeah, like you, I don't know the answer, although I'm pretty certain that there are no flights. I'm pretty certain that there are no flights. I think it's a drive from Windhoek up towards Etosha, which isn't an arduous journey, in fairness. It's the B1 road, which is a tarred road that goes up for about 3 hours from Windhoek, and then you're going over to the west to a reserve or to a lodge on the west, which is I think about an hour and a half from that tarred road. And the journeys in Namibia don't need to be painfully long, and I think that this itinerary has been constructed in such a way that they are not painfully long.
No, sure. Hey Nick, would you be kind enough to put up that last slide?
Yes, of course. Yep.
Promoting the next of the events
there you go.
we have going on. Thank you very much. So look, Nick, thanks so much. That was absolutely brilliant, wonderful. I'm very conscious, as you are, of time, and we've still got lots of people on board, which is really super. But just want to mention that we've got a Brazil presentation coming on Wednesday, Discover Brazil, and which is with Emma, and we have Discover Ecuador on the 25th of January. Both of them at our usual time and place, which is here online. Discover Ecuador is being done by Mike Dilger, Discover Brazil with Emma. So please do sign up for those. And a final thank you to everybody for being on board with us this evening. And thank you to Nick. That was absolutely brilliant.
Very welcome. Good night, everybody.
Good night.